Hello! Today I'm here with my December wrap-up, and I actually managed to read an awful lot more in December than I was anticipating. I didn't feel like it was a particularly good reading month, but looking back on it, I actually managed to read quite a lot of books, so I'm really happy about that. I'm going to sort of break this up into categories, so I'm going to start with the books that I read for the Schwabathon, then I'm going to talk about the audiobooks that I read, then some manga, and then I read one book that doesn't fall into any of those categories, so I will come to that one last. So kicking it off with the Schwabathon, which is a readathon, if you didn't know, that I am running with Nisha from the channel On the Margins Of. I will link our announcement videos somewhere. Essentially, the aim of the game on this one is to read as many of V.E. Schwab's works as possible throughout the months of December and January. And if you haven't joined in yet and you want to, please do so. Let me know and I can join you to our Twitter chat, because we may be extending this into February as well. So kicking it off with the first book of Schwab's that I read in December is City of Ghosts. This book is a middle grade fantasy novel, or paranormal fantasy really, and it's middle grade, like I said, so it's aimed at 8 to 12-year-olds, but I personally really love reading books in this age range. They're just a little bit easier. To read, and I quite like it to break up some of the heavier books that I read. This one follows a girl named Cass who can see ghosts. Her best friend is a ghost and her parents are ghost hunters. And when her parents get selected to film a ghost hunting documentary in Edinburgh, she moves with them there for the summer and discovers that Edinburgh has a lot of ghosts. And this book was really reminiscent for me of the Mediator series by Meg Cabot, which I read when I was around 8 to 12 years old and really loved. And Cass is a pretty similar character to the main character in that, whose name I actually can't remember. And the relationship between her and her ghostly best friend is also very similar to the best friend relationship in the Mediator series, and I just really enjoyed reading this one. It was a really quick read for me. I read it in about 2 days, and if I hadn't had to go to work I probably would have finished it in one. It was really good and I would highly recommend it. The next book that I read in the Schwabathon was The Archived, which is the first book in a duology. This actual book contains both of the duology books, which is The Archived and The Unbound. I haven't read The Unbound yet, I plan to, but I did read The Archived in December and I did really enjoy it. The concept for this one is really intriguing. It is young adult urban fantasy, and the twist on our world in this one is that when people die, their memories are preserved in sort of a corpse version of themselves, but not like in the state that the person died. So if somebody was really messed up, it's a good version of themselves, but that's where their memories are stored, in the archive. And there are librarians that are their keepers while they are in the archive, and then we have our main character. Mackenzie Bishop is a keeper, and her job is to return the dead if they awaken. The concept is, like I said, super interesting. The payoff unfortunately wasn't as good. The beginning of the story for me was a little bit slow, but the pace did pick up by about 25-30% of the way through, and I did really enjoy it. But my main issue with this book was that I think that it would have been better if it was a multiple perspective story. This story is actually just single perspective. We just follow the internal narrative of Mackenzie, our main character, and actually there were a few really interesting characters in this book that I think, had we had some internal monologue from them at some point, then it really would have added a lot to the story. For example, there's a librarian in this novel called Roland, who is a really interesting character, and it would have been great to get some of the story from his perspective. It's a little bit narrow just being from Mackenzie's perspective, in my opinion. She's very young, and so we do get that very young vibe to the whole story, and I am interested to see where this is going to go in the book The Unbound. The end was pretty good. There were some surprises. I do think that the end was a little bit rushed, which is ironic given that the beginning of the story was a bit slow and the end was a bit too fast. If it had just been spread out a bit more, then it would have worked better for me, I think. But I did still really enjoy this book, and I am still looking forward to reading the second book in the duology, hopefully relatively soon. The next book that I read for the Schwabathon was Vicious, and this is a book that I have heard an awful lot about. There was a new release in this series just last year in 2018, which was Vengeful, and that's been a long time coming. I believe there's about 5 or 6 years in between the two books. This one follows two friends, Victor and Eli, and they're friends in university who are extremely bright, and they're both very scientific, and they engage in an experiment to create what is called an extraordinary, essentially a superhero, and they successfully figure out how to create extraordinaries and become extraordinaries. Jump forwards 10 years, and all of a sudden they're not friends anymore. They are arch nemesis. And this book is sort of about discovering what it is that happened in their relationship. And there are some pretty explosive scenes in this towards the end. The pacing is pretty smooth throughout for me. I really enjoyed it. Do I think it's as incredible as everybody raves about? No, I don't. It is a very good book and I did enjoy it, but I don't necessarily understand what all of the hype is about. It's not the best book I've ever read and oh my god, I need to read the sequel now. Like, usually when I finish a book that's really good, I can't wait and I pick up the sequel immediately. But this one, I haven't read Vengeful yet. I will read it, I am still interested, but I don't know, it was an interesting book. I did like the character of Victor, wasn't so keen on the character of Eli. It is an interesting concept, it is an interesting story, there's some good character development, there is some good plot development, and some interesting things do happen. But just bear in mind that this one is one of those where I don't necessarily think that all of the hype is warranted. It's a good book, but not anything to rave review about, in my opinion. If you love this one, great, tell me why down below, I'd love to know. Moving on to the audiobooks that I read in the month of December, I read The Northern Lights and The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman, and these were rereads for me. I read this series when I was around 11 for the first time, and I'm not actually sure whether these are classed as middle grade books or young adult books. To be honest, I think either could read them, but I think the crucial thing about these is that depending on the age you are when you read them, you will notice very different things about them, and the themes are quite adult, but they're subtle. So I found that reading these at the age I am now, 27, was a very different experience than reading them when I was 11, because now I'm old enough to pick up on some of the subtle and slightly darker themes. There's a lot of controversy around this series, which became particularly prevalent at the time that the film came out, which I think was about maybe 8 years ago, maybe a bit longer than that. And at the time, I didn't understand why the books were so controversial. Having read them at the age of at 11, I didn't get it. But now that I've reread them, I now understand why the books are controversial. There is a lot of criticism of religion. Essentially, in these books, the church is the antagonist, and now that I'm old, I can understand why that's a little bit controversial, because these books can be quite critical of organised religion. I mean, the focus in this particular story is on Catholicism, but to be honest, you know, it's probably fairly transferable across most religions, and it is critical of that. And I personally don't have a problem with that, and I found that aspect really quite interesting to read at the age that I am. But the plot and the characters were still just as enjoyable as they were when I was 11 years old. I still found myself just as absorbed in the story, just as connected to the characters. I didn't like The Subtle Knife as much as I liked The Northern Lights, and since then I've read The Amber Spyglass, which I like the most, but I'll talk about that in my January wrap up because I have quite a lot of feelings about that one. But yeah, definitely preferred The Northern Lights to The Subtle Knife, and I think the reason for that is should probably tell you what these are about. This book follows our main protagonist named Lyra Balakwa, who lives at Jordan College, which is an Oxford college, and she is raised there, and she's really good at lying and sneaking about and using her imagination. And when a woman named Mrs. Coulter comes into her life and children have been going missing, she finds that her life completely changes, and she goes on adventures to track down her friend Roger, who was taken by the gobblers, child snatchers essentially. And we follow her journey and we learn about dust, which I'm not going to go into because it's a major theme of the book. What is dust? But it's dust with a capital D, not dust as in the dust that humans create. It's a really, really interesting story. It's really individual. I don't see a lot of comparisons between this book and other books necessarily, but our character Lyra in this one is really strong-willed, really brave, really doesn't rely on anyone other than herself. Whereas in The Subtle Knife, that's not necessarily the case so much. And I'm not going to go into it because I don't want to give any spoilers, but some of her bravery seems to disappear, and some of that has to do with the fact that she starts relying on a man, essentially, and that really bugged me. So I didn't like The Subtle Knife as much, but I did enjoy both of these, and I really enjoyed revisiting this world and this story at an older age, and I did take a lot more away from it than I did the first time around. Now we're going to move on to manga, and I continued with my read of the Full Metal Alchemist series this month, so I finished the bind up of volumes 1, 2 and 3 by reading volume 3, and then I also read volumes 4 and 5 from the next bind up, and I'm really getting into this story now. In case you don't know what this is about, essentially we follow two young men, Edward and Alphonse Elric, who are alchemists, and when they lost their mother, they attempted to bring her back through alchemy, but it went horribly wrong and resulted in Edward losing an arm and Alphonse losing his entire body. And in order to preserve Alphonse's soul in a suit of armour, Edward gives up his leg. And we follow their adventures trying to restore themselves to the way they were before things went horribly wrong. Also, they're state alchemists, so they get involved in a lot of detective work, I suppose. And I'm really enjoying this series, actually. The first maybe 2-3 volumes were sort of just me kind of getting used to reading manga in the first place and getting used to the characters and the world and what was going on. But it's really surprising because sometimes it's hilarious, sometimes it's really sad, sometimes it's scary, sometimes it's horrifying, and I really enjoy that roller coaster of emotions in this, and I think it's really special to be able to get that roller coaster of emotions in something that contains so few words. Because, I mean, if you compare the amount of words in one of these to one of these, it's worlds apart, but we still get just as much emotion in these, if not more, than in some other books that I read. What I'm quite enjoying now is that we're starting to get more into the detail of Edward and Alphonse's backstory, and I'm really, really enjoying that. I really like their characters, and I'm really interested to see where these are going to go. And finally, in the month of December, we have the book that didn't fit into any other category, but I loved just the same, which is Nevermore by Jessica Townsend. And in this one, we follow a girl named Morrigan Crow who is cursed. Everything that goes wrong in the town that she lives in is blamed on her. And the crux of her curse is that she will die on her 11th birthday. But when her 11th birthday comes around, instead of being killed, she is whisked away by a man named Jupiter North to a place called Nevermore to compete in the trials to join an academy. Now, I've mentioned before, and I'll say it again, the tournament trope is one of my absolute favourites. I love that trope. And alongside a trope that I love, we have some hilarious characters, some wonderful character development, some very whimsical and picturesque world that doesn't require too much imagination, but that is just so much fun. Morrigan moves into Jupiter North's hotel, and to me, the hotel is like the room of requirement from Harry Potter. That is that it becomes whatever you want it to be. It's a hotel that has its own personality. And it's such a whimsical book. It's really, really lovely. I'm really looking forward to reading the next book in the series, which is called The Wondersmith. I don't know how many books are going to be in this series, but I think there are going to be quite a few, so I'm really looking forward to that. The next book, actually I'm not going to tell you what the next book is about because it potentially could give you spoilers for this one, but there are some great friendships, there are some great relationships, there's some great character development, the plot is interesting, the setting is interesting, it's a really easy read, it's a really fun read. It was a really good time of year, I think, for me to read this book. I essentially read it over the Christmas holiday, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I would highly recommend it. And that's it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of December. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button. I'd be so, so grateful. And I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks. Bye.